Welcome. This is Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University, and this video lecture is on poetry and interpersonal processes, using poetry to facilitate self-exploration and self-awareness. This is lecture 2 of 6 in a series of lectures on poetry, healing, and growth that can be watched together or independently. Just as an overview of what will be covered in this short lecture, is going to start talking about the unconscious. Then I'll talk a little bit about poetry as a way of knowing, poetry of others, one's own poetry, and tracking change. And I'll incorporate in a couple of illustrations as we get towards the end. First, with the unconscious. Poems, I think, are closely connected to the unconscious, that they often emerge in part from the unconscious. They represent the aspects of the unconscious, so they are hard to separate from the unconscious in many different ways. The symbols and metaphors in particular come from the unconscious. They often have multiple meanings to them, and this is done often intentionally by poets. So a poet may choose a particular image to have multiple meanings, or because it has multiple meanings, maybe even because its meaning is ambiguous and people could bring different meanings to it. So this is some of the art of writing poetry. For example, a pen could mean something very basic in a sense of what a pen is, but it can also be used to illustrate something, a way of communicating. It could be used to illustrate one's voice. It could be used to illustrate a number of different things. So this is part of why symbols and imagery are so powerful, is because they can take a poem that maybe otherwise would have one meaning and bring multiple meanings to it, so we can continue to look at it. But sometimes these symbols come from the unconscious. There are times when I've chosen a symbol and I've wondered later, why did I choose that symbol there? That I'm not even sure that makes sense. And as I think about it more and more, I begin to recognize where that came from, or at least where it may have come from. And so the unconscious sometimes does this work for us outside of our awareness. And this is one of the really beautiful things about poetry, is that we don't always know the meanings to even our own poems, because they do arise from the unconscious. And because of this, I like to think of poems as something that we can interpret much in the same way that we do dreams. Obviously, they're not exactly the same as dreams, but there are ways, I think, that we can interpret them in the same ways. And when I work with poems in the context of therapy as a therapist, I will often use techniques that I use with dream interpretation with poems. Looking at the symbols, looking at the different meanings. I'll encourage clients not to hold on to a single meaning. And we'll often ask them things such as, what do you think this might mean? Or do you think there might be other meanings to this symbol, or they could be seen in a different way? And as clients start to approach it that way, the different meanings come about. And so there can be, in dreams we talk about manifest and latent content, with the manifest being that which is more evident, that which can be interpreted more straightforwardly, and the latent being that which is more hidden, more in that unconscious. And so I will encourage clients to look at the latent content as well, as what might this mean that they were not aware of as they wrote the poem. And so there can be a number of ways that we start to unpack these unconscious elements that often find their way into the poems. Okay, and as I've mentioned, poems will often emerge from this kind of unknown place, that I'll find that sometimes I almost feel like I've been captured by something, that this image or this line has come to me, and I'm not sure where it came from, but it's just captured me, and that I'm drawn to it, and I feel like I need to do something with this. And sometimes it's not at first that I find the direction that it can go, although I often will try and play around with it there at first, and at least give an initial attempt. But a number of times I've had something that might just be a line from a poem that came to me, and I've written it down, and sometimes I'll have a page for the poem that's just written there, just that one line, and I'll try and write a poem, and it just doesn't feel right. It's not good. It doesn't seem to go anywhere. It doesn't seem to have any meaning, and I'll keep coming back and trying to write a poem from this. There's one that I had been playing with a line for about 2 years, and I just could not find uh, the way to develop the poem. And finally, I found a place that developed into a poem that felt pretty good. That wasn't a great poem, but it felt pretty good in that it was representing, I think, something more along the lines of what that line represented. I'm still not sure that line is done. I think there may be another poem that comes from it that's still a better poem and a better interpretation of where that began. But again, I think some of it may be that I don't fully know where this was coming from, where this line was coming from, and that's part of why it's lingering in this way with me. And so I think this is why many poems will talk about being caught up in the creative process or being in the zone when they're writing. And I'll find this often that I would guess a number of poems that I've written that I feel pretty good about were written very quickly. Now, going back and editing them takes sometimes quite a bit of time. It might be sometimes just small little tweakings and changes, finding a better word here or there, condensing a little bit here and there. But the majority of the poem came out all at once in this very emotional process, and it just felt right. And even when it was done, it felt right. It felt like closure was there. And so this is kind of, I think, similar to what athletes sometimes talk about in being in the zone. They just felt like they were on that day, like they're captured. There was something going. And when athletes talk about being in the zone, they'll often talk about it as something where they're not thinking, they're just reacting, they're just doing. It's not something that's forced. And this, I think, will be very similar with a lot of poets when they find that they're caught in this creative process or in this zone of writing, and a poem will just emerge. But because one is just in this kind of reflexive type state where things are just emerging, again, it's going to come a lot more from the unconscious. And so coming back and looking at that later, there may be themes that can be unpacked, new insights that can come from that. So the unconscious is particularly active often at these times when we're in the zone or caught up in the process. So if we think of poetry and the unconscious and the ways of going through these to help facilitate self-awareness and self-exploration, we can then very naturally start talking about poetry as a way of knowing. Now, the field of epistemology, this is a nice fancy word that philosophers and psychologists and scientists, although I wish scientists and psychologists would use it more often, will often use. It refers to the idea of how do we know what we know. And so when we talk about poetry as a way of knowing, we're talking about poetry as a form of epistemology. And there's been some interesting work that has been done recently with the idea of arts-based knowing, or arts-based inquiry. And a colleague of mine, Arnie Collin, developed a course about this and was very interested in this, and in ways that we use art to explore the world, to know the world. And I believe that poetry often illuminates knowledge that other forms of communication just are not able to. It can communicate, even though it's abstract and often unclear, it's still often much more clear than what we'll see trying to get at certain ideas through other ways of knowing. And so when we think of poetry as a way of knowing, there's many different things that can be a part of that. All of these may not be a part of it each time, but they can be connected in there. I think one of the primary ones is emotions. That unfortunately, emotions as a way of knowing is undervalued. That in Western culture, we often think of emotions as irrational, and this is seen as a negative thing, that emotions are seen as a lesser way of knowing, and even as distorting reason, as creating problems. You can see this very directly in a lot of writing and philosophy and science and psychology, and then you can see it implicit in a lot of ways. But emotions are a valid way of knowing. Humanistic, existential, Jungian, psychodynamic perspectives within psychology will often emphasize this, is that emotions are a valid way of knowing. Now, it might be a different type of knowing at times, but it also can be a very similar type of knowing to what we even talk about in science at times. That there's ways that emotions can guide us. So emotions are a valuable way of knowing. I don't think we should ever take emotions just by themselves and as the only way of knowing, just as I don't think we should use science or reason or any type of knowing by itself. We should always look at multiple ways of knowing that can help critique and reflect and sharpen other ways of knowing. But emotions is an important one, and poetry often reflects this quite well, these emotional ways of knowing. The unconscious and symbolic, again, these are ways of knowing. The unconscious, is viewed by many as being something that is uh, unwise and that's maybe caught up in distortions or problems. But Jung really thought of the unconscious as something that is quite wise. And so do many other depth psychologists, including many humanistic and existential therapists. And I would very much fall in this position that I think the unconscious is quite wise. So when I'm getting to the point of making a major decision in my life, for example, I often pay more attention to my dreams and will use them as something that helps me to make decisions and helps me to think about a decision. I'm not going to make a big decision just based upon a dream, just like I'm not going to make a big decision just based upon emotion, but I'm also not going to make them just based upon reason. I'm going to look at all of these together. So poetry can bring this unconscious way of knowing and a symbolic way of knowing. Closely connected with that is the idea of paradox. Now, in our more typical ways of communicating, paradoxes are tough. That we will talk about paradox and it doesn't see how they go together. One of the things that I love about poetry is that it finds these ways to hold paradox. And you'll find in so many poems that they're paradoxical. They will show two or more different sides of a perspective and how they really are together, even though they seem contradictory, how they are together. Such as one of the great paradoxes of knowing and not knowing, of faith and doubt, that they're always in the process of knowing is a process of unknowing, that our unknowing, our doubt, keeps us in that pursuit. And whenever we get too firmly convinced that we know something, we shut ourselves off from knowing that thing more deeply. So knowing always contains with it a bit of unknown. This can be held together often in a poem much better than what it can be held together in just descriptive language or narrative language. So poems are a great paradoxical way of knowing. There can be interpersonal elements, both in that poems often emerge from an interpersonal context. They might emerge from an interaction. A number of poems that I've written over the years began as a conversation, as an email, as a conversation with someone in person. It's class lectures, and this idea just came to me that stuck with me and became a poem. And in some ways, I always feel like, well, this isn't just my poem. It's a shared poem because it came out of this process. So there can be interpersonal ways of knowing, but also as we unpack poems, it's very interpersonal, and we get to see the different understandings and meanings that can be connected there. There can be spiritual aspects of it, and looking beyond oneself, looking beyond the personal, knowing beyond the personal. And there can be cultural aspects, and that poetry often is strongly influenced by culture, both in style, in symbols, in language. There can be many aspects of it that are quite connected to culture. I think particularly a lot of times those symbolic ways of knowing come out quite strongly in the culture, but also the style, that there is a style of poetry that's connected with different cultures, that might be more of a rhythmic or rhyming style versus more of a free verse style. But this can be closely connected to cultural aspects as well. And the rhythm, the style, all these different things I think are part of the meaning of the poem too. We shouldn't understand the meaning just by the words. We have to look at the poem and how it flows, how it comes together, how it presents itself, the pauses, the commas, the periods, the italics, the spaces, the rhythm, the rhyming, all these things are part of the meaning with a poem. So poetry reflects, I think, a very interesting way of knowing. It reflects a very interesting epistemology or epistemological approach, I think. Well, poetry of others. We can use poetry of others to search ourselves as well and to increase our own self-knowledge. Sometimes this can be through understanding basic truths, and I use that in the idea of a small t truth. They're basic truths that may resonate with us, that we grasp through the knowledge shared in the poem, but also they can be a starting point for a deeper type of exploration, for meditation. You know, sacred scriptures, often people will take a small chunk of these and then they'll meditate on them. I think something can be done with poems, very similar, which is part of why I often like to start my day with a poem, or in my day reading a poem, or read a poem before I'm going for a walk. So it's percolating there, and it can be something that starts a process of reflection. So we may connect with poems of others through the unconscious as well. And this can be in many ways, but one of them that I think is particular is pay attention to some of the things, such as the styles we were drawn to, or the things that we're mysteriously drawn to. Now the styles, again, that can have some cultural elements to it. There may be a meaning somehow in that style that they're drawn. For example, very short contained poems, if that's the preference, that might mean something. It might symbolize the need for containment. Poems that need to have a happy ending, well, that might mean something. Poems that are left open, that might mean something. So pay attention to the styles of poems that you're drawn to, and if there's a theme in them. Maybe you're only interested in poems about loss. They're the only ones that seem to resonate with you, or about nature, or about beauty. Well, again, all this means something. Then I think it's good to pay attention as well to poems, as well as songs, movies, and other art forms that you find yourself drawn to and you may not understand why. Often there's a meaning there that maybe one hasn't fully resonated with yet, hasn't fully understood or unpacked yet. So it's very important to come back and look at these, and maybe over time we'll understand. There's been times where I've been drawn to a song, and when I first listened to that song, it's like, I have no idea what that song means. I don't know what it even means for me. But then as I came back to it and listened to it over and over again, it started to unpack itself. And with songs like this, I might listen to them 10, 15 times over and over again, and see if something emerges. And I'll do similar things with poems, that I might read it over and over again. I might read it a couple times a day for several days and see if the meaning there opens up to me. And often I find that the poems that at first I don't understand hold the deepest meanings for me. So I think that's really critical, that often the poems that I at first don't understand, or don't understand why I'm drawn to them, often are the ones that have the deepest meanings to me, as I stick with them and search for that meaning. Another thing that can be really helpful is in the self-exploration process is reading a poem as if it's one's own and then interpreting it. So what might this poem mean if it was yours? In the lecture 1 for this, I talked about using that as a way of providing feedback to poems, a way to start a conversation about a poem that someone else has written. But it can also be a very nice way of starting a process of self-exploration. So reading a poem as if it's one's own can serve several purposes. It can be used with poetry in different ways. I already mentioned this rereading over time, and then again, this is a theme that will come up in all the lectures frequently. Stay open to new meanings. Always stay open to new meanings that you might find in the poem. Imitating or rewriting as one's own poem. This can be done, one, as a way to try and increase one's skill and style and learn a new form of poetry, but it can also be done as a way of self-exploration. So if you find a poem that's meaningful to you, maybe it's meaningful but doesn't quite completely fit right, you might try and imitate it or extend it or rewrite it in your own poetic form and see what happens, and come back to it, and then from there you can see if it opens up something to you. I think it's good when you do this, if you share these type of poems, that you're upfront about that, so people don't think that you're plagiarizing or stealing poems, that parts of it come across as pretty similar to someone else's. But you'll see some poets even do this with their published poems, where they'll say it was inspired by or drawing upon a style of some other poet that they have read. So this can be done again for expanding one's poetic voice, but it can also be done for self-exploration. Looking at one's own poem, well, obviously the unconscious again comes back as a key piece when we look at self-exploration. But I think also just that process of sitting down and writing. Often, while writing, even when it's in conscious, even the conscious elements, open things up to me, that by what comes out as I'm putting it there and putting it in different words and trying to think about how do I put this in a word, in a form that really is expressing what I'm getting at, or that really is expressing what I'm feeling, or that really illustrates my experience here. When we think about writing from the unconscious, it can be helpful to be intentional about inviting the unconscious into our writing. Now that can be done in different ways. It can be done, again, by trying to get into this zone or mood, and creating the mood. That when I'm writing about certain things, I'll put on certain music, that I'll create different playlists of music that I'll listen to for different types of writing that I'm going to do. And often that helps to create this mood or zone that facilitates the writing in a lot of ways. And I think that, again, because it's drawing in this emotional element to it, it often influences the unconscious in different ways. We can invite symbols in. Jumping down to the bottom here, we can symbols, images, poetry lines that we keep returning to. We can use these as a starting point. It may be writing about a symbol, it may be incorporating a symbol, it may be meditating on a symbol and seeing where it goes. But there can be a variety of ways that this brings them in. And then saving early drafts. I'm jumping around a little bit on those last 2 points there. But saving the early drafts of writing, particularly ones that were written without screening at all, and then coming back to them. So sometimes an early draft of a poem may not be as good of a poem, but it might have a more important insight. It might help you understand something that you weren't recognizing. So as someone that likes to constantly tinker and update, anytime I make a big change, I try and save different drafts of it. I think that's quite important in this insight process, in the self-exploration process. Interpreting poems in the unconscious, here we come back to that same line that I use over and over and over. Stay open to the multiple meanings. Use the dream interpretation techniques. I referred to this some already, and particularly to the one of if this were my poem, it might mean reading it as if it was one's own voice. But we can also do it by looking at what are the images that stand out, and then doing some free associating to the images or metaphors in there, or the emotional parts, or whatever stands out to you as the person who's written the poem. Or if you're using someone else's poem, whatever stands out as what really strikes you there, and free association to it. Allowing the poem to have different meanings over time, which is another variant of that, being open to multiple meanings. Using trusted others in groups, that often when sharing things that I've written further and sharing with other people, they might come up with an interpretation of it or an idea about it that I hadn't thought of that really seems to make sense and hold true, or maybe it didn't hold true, but it sends me off thinking in another direction that deepens the self-exploration process. One must, it's one of the reasons why one must always be aware, and whenever sharing a poem in a group, that it may take a direction that you're not expecting. So there's a certain amount of courage that is involved in sharing one's poetry due to this, but it can be a very powerful thing as well. And then combining poetry with journaling. And in the first lecture in this series, I talked about how many of my poems emerged from journaling. I started as journaling and it became poetry. But I think we can also start with a poem and then have that lead to journaling. That if you have a poem that you've written that just really was emotional, or you had an emotional reaction at the end of it, or maybe when you came back to it. Journaling about that can be a helpful way of continuing to pursue the insight. Okay, I'm going to go to an illustration here, and this is a little more of a simplistic illustration. It's using a poem of my own. It's hard to illustrate self-exploration and self-awareness through another, and it's not illustrating necessarily a really profound insight, but it is one that has continued to unfold and in ways become more meaningful. This is a poem that was written for my father from the context of being a father myself, and thinking about his reaction and my reactions to young sons coming in at night. So I'll read the poem and I'll talk a little bit more about it. Brown chair. Smooth leather, buttoned down and curved in all the wrong places. That old brown chair stayed at my bedside desk, rarely used for homework or drawing. Yet each night, if the fear came upon me, I timidly come into your room and beckon you to allay the fears. You sat patiently, occupying that lonely brown chair that was not built for comfort. If you got up before my eyes stayed closed, I called out, and you stayed. Each night, you stayed. Such a seemingly simple act of love, staying, being present. Yet not till my own young son timidly came to my bedside. Papa? Did I recognize this sacrifice, this act of love? Frustrated and awakened, I remember being held in your love. And I say, I am right here. You are safe now. And I know your love has become my love. So again, it's a rather simple poem. I have not come to feeling like it's all that good of a poem. Maybe with some tweaking over time it'll become there, but at the same time it's a poem that to me is quite meaningful. It's meaningful because of the reflection that I had, that a fair amount of the meaning of this poem was evident and even intent as I started to write it, that I had been thinking about the love of my father had for me, and how that was represented in his willingness to come in and sit with me in a child when we moved into a new bedroom that had different sounds and was darker than before, and he would just patiently come in and sit with me. And I think before becoming a father, I appreciated it, but there was something that just hit one night that helped me recognize how much of an act of love that was. I think before I'd seen it more as that he was a patient man, and now I saw it more deeply as love. Where for me one of the insights came was at the end of writing this poem. The last line was not one that I had intended. It's not one that I had thought about. So all the way up until close to the end of this poem, it was something that I had intended kind of at the beginning of the poem. But those last 3 lines, and I know your love has become my love. That was not something that was there when I first started writing. It was an insight that came out of it, a recognition of how this love was passed on through generations. And in many ways, it's my father's love that now has become my love for my young sons. And so this became much more powerful and meaningful to me through that insight. And as I've come back to read this poem a few times since I've written, that the interconnectedness of this love is something that has really stood out to me. And I've understood it a little differently too. So there is an aspect of knowing and insight that came through the writing process. And there was a deepening of that came as I came back and read this poem and went through it later on. Tracking change. I love watching how themes and kind of develop in different poems over time, whether that be clients that are bringing poems to me, people that I see sharing poems that are wrestling with similar themes, or my own poems that watching this, how it just, the theme will change over time. It may be very subtle, and I'll use a subtle an example of a subtle one here in just a few minutes. This can be the different drafts of the same poem, or it can be the same theme over time. It can be a way of documenting or reflecting upon. And as I look at those different themes sometimes, it can be quite helpful to, again, come back and notice those. When clients bring those to me as a therapist, those are really powerful. Watching as a client changes a poem. And sometimes I'll ask a client to take a poem and I want you to go back and I want you to rewrite this, see if it's any different. You can keep aspects of the same, but see if anything's different if you were to write it now. And sometimes they'll come in with a line different or a stanza different, or sometimes it ends up a whole new poem, and then we'll talk about that change. And it can be quite powerful. Sometimes they'll just add on to it too, that the story wasn't complete in a sense, and now they complete the story, take it a bit further. But all of those things can really help show the change over time, and then journaling about or talking through those can be quite powerful in the self-exploration and the self-insight that comes from that. An example that I would use is this was in 2 different poems that I wrote that I've spoken about elsewhere. I wrote a series of poems about a pet that was very close to me, Amaya, and I used poetry as the primary way of grieving for her after she died. And there was a line that I wrote in the first poem, the night that she died, and the line was simply, "Night that held no peace for me." And I wrote a second poem, and the line came out, it's a different poem, it wasn't a rewriting of the first, but there's a lot of parallels. And the line that was included there is, "But I would not accept its peace," referring to the night. But I would not, so basically I would not accept the night's peace. Now this was a very significant change to me. It might seem very subtle, but I think it's quite significant that there's this shift from night that held no peace for me. That really emphasized something out there, something beyond. I didn't have control. But in the second one, but I would not accept its peace. So there, it's bringing my choice into it. I'm feeling a little less helpless about this process. I'm about the grieving, about Amaya's death, but also about the grieving. That for me, I am pretty intentional about not accepting peace that when I think peace is not what is needed at the time. So in grieving or working through other types of sadness or suffering, I don't want the peace premature. I want to work to it. I want to earn the peace that comes, and recognize that it may not be a full peace that ever comes around that particular issue. And so this not accepting the peace was in many ways my saying, I'm going to grieve and I'm going to continue loving you. So this was very powerful change to me as I reflected back on it, even though I'm guessing many people might read these 2 lines and say, well, it's not really saying that much different. But emotionally, in that context, it really was. Okay, tracking changes. I've kind of referred to this already as self and connected to the therapist a bit, but I think this can be really helpful in progress. And as a therapist, I will often ask clients if they're okay with me keeping a copy of a poem when they bring it in. And I think it's very important that we always tell clients what we're going to do with that and are clear about that and document around that. But I think it can be helpful to keep track of that. And so I will note in my progress notes that the client brought in a poem and that I kept a copy of that poem with the client's permission. I generally will not write up any interpretation of the poem in there. although at times I may reflect on changes that I see in the themes if they do bring other poems in or different versions of the same poem. But again, it can be a nice way of tracking the progress made in therapy as looking at clients, how they relate to different issues or how a poem changes over time. So I think it's very helpful in that sense. Okay, well, that concludes this lecture. The other lectures will be available through this web link down here below, just at myacademia.edu webpage under teaching videos, and also on YouTube. So you can go to either one of these to see the others as they are ready and posted. And the first one is already up there.